Before anyone in Harwick's grocery store noticed the fluorescent lights flickering above aisle 7, before the woman in the pale green coat stopped breathing mid-reach for a jar she didn't need, a voice came from somewhere behind her that turned her blood to standing water. Sable. One word. Her name. In a mouth she had spent 9 months trying to forget. She didn't turn around. Not yet. Because turning around meant confirming what every nerve in her body was already screaming. And confirmation meant it was real. And if it was real, then the man she had fled in the middle of a February night, with nothing but a duffel bag, a burner phone, and a baby not yet visible beneath her coat, had just found her. Then came the second thing, worse than the voice. A laugh. Soft. Female. Familiar in the way that only a betrayal can make a stranger's laugh feel familiar. He wasn't alone. Harwick's had been open since 1987. It sat on the corner of Delmore Avenue and Route 9 in a mid-sized city that had once had ambitions and had since made peace with something smaller. The sign above the entrance was missing its apostrophe. The parking lot had a crack running diagonally across it that the city had been meaning to fix for 3 years. Inside, the floors were the color of old cream, worn smooth in the paths people always took. From the entrance to the produce, from produce to dairy, from dairy to the checkout lanes at the far end where the light was always slightly too yellow and the conveyor belts moved with a slowness that felt almost deliberate. It was a store where people bought things they actually needed. Not curated, not artisanal. Just bread and milk and soup that came in a can and tasted precisely like childhood. A place where nobody looked at you twice because everyone was occupied being tired in their own quiet way. Sable Voss had chosen it for that reason. She had been shopping here for 6 weeks. Always on Tuesday mornings between 9 and 10, when the aisles were thin with people and the staff were restocking shelves, and nobody asked questions or made eye contact long enough to remember a face. She wore the same pale green coat every time because it was shapeless and unremarkable, and hid, for now, the roundness that was becoming harder to conceal. She paid in cash. She kept her head low. She had become, through practice and necessity, a woman who knew how to move through a public space without leaving a trace of herself behind. She had almost believed it was working. The flickering light above aisle 7 had been broken for 2 weeks. She knew this because she had noticed it the first time she came down this aisle and filed it away the way she filed everything, the habit of someone living in a state of permanent low-level alertness toward their own surroundings. She had learned to read rooms, to read exits, to read the difference between a man who was simply walking in her direction and a man whose path ended with her. She had not read this one coming. Nobody had. Sable Voss was 32 years old. She had dark auburn hair that she kept pinned at the back of her neck, not because she preferred it that way, but because loose hair drew attention, and she had learned, in the last 9 months, to make every decision in service of invisibility. Her hands were steady. They had not always been. There had been a period of 4 months, roughly 3 months after she left, when her hands shook every morning when she made her tea. When she dropped things without warning. When she reached for a glass and watched her own fingers tremble as though they belonged to someone else. Stopping it had taken work. Every morning she stood at the kitchen counter of her studio apartment on Fenwick Street and gripped the edge until her knuckles whitened and her breath steadied and the shaking passed. And eventually it had. The trembling was gone, but the vigilance never left. She was 7 months pregnant. The coat concealed most of it. Her posture concealed the rest. Over time, without intending to, she had developed a posture she used only in public, shoulders slightly forward, one arm resting across her midsection. Not clutching, just resting, the way a person rests a hand on a table. Natural enough that no one noticed. Deliberate enough that she always knew where her body ended and the world began. Every morning before she left the apartment, she did the same 4 things. She checked the deadbolt twice. She looked through the peephole before opening the door. She took the back stairwell instead of the elevator. And she stood on the sidewalk for a measured 30 seconds before moving, scanning the street methodically, left to right, near to far, the way a person reads a document they cannot afford to misunderstand. Then she pressed one hand flat against her stomach, just below the curve where the baby sat heaviest in the mornings, and she said the same thing she had been saying every day since she found out she was expecting. "We're okay. We're still okay." It wasn't a prayer exactly. It was more like a contract, something she renewed daily because daily was all she could promise. Next week was not a promise she could make. Next month was not either. The man she had once called her husband. She could not promise he would not one day appear in a place she believed was safe. She could not promise any of that. But she could promise today. And so today was what she promised. Every morning, standing on the sidewalk of Fenwick Street with her hand on her stomach and her eyes moving left to right until she was certain. Certain every morning for 9 months, not for the last 43 seconds. His name was Crisanto Vale. She had stopped using his last name 7 months ago when she filed the paperwork at the county clerk's office under a name she had never told him. She had sat in a plastic chair with a numbered ticket and waited 40 minutes, and when the clerk called her number, she slid the forms across the counter with fingers that did not shake, because she had practiced not shaking for 3 weeks, specifically for that moment. The clerk stamped the papers without looking up. And that had been the end of Crisanto Vale as her legal reality. But legal reality and lived reality were two different countries with no shared border. 6 years ago, she had met him at a charity event. One she attended because a colleague had invited her, and she had nothing better to do on a Thursday evening. He was standing near the back of the room in a dark suit, not circulating, not performing the way men at those events usually performed, just watching. She had thought, at the time, that his stillness was confidence. She had been wrong. Stillness, she would learn, is not always the same as calm. Sometimes it is what a predator does before it moves. He had approached her at exactly the right moment, said exactly the right things. He was attentive in a way that felt, in the beginning, like being chosen. He remembered details she had mentioned once in passing, the name of her college roommate, the coffee order she had not repeated, the way she always reached for her left ear when she was nervous. At the time, she had believed this meant he loved her. It meant he was building a file. They were married 14 months after they met. The wedding was small at his insistence. Family only, he said. But his family was extensive and loud and filled the room, and hers occupied a single table near the back. Her college friend Dara, her neighbor Mrs. Pelton, who had known her since she was 9, and her Aunt Cecile, who had flown in from Portland. 3 people. He had not commented on this. He had filed it away the way a man files a weakness he intends to use later. The control had not announced itself. It never did. It arrived quietly, the way water arrives in a basement. By the time you notice it, it has been there long enough to do real damage. First it was her phone. Not taken, never taken, but remarked upon. Who was that? Why did she text so late? Did she know how that looked? Then it was her friendships. Dara had been the first to go, pushed out through a series of manufactured slights that Sable had not recognized as manufactured until 2 years later, when she finally had the distance to see clearly. Then Mrs. Pelton, then Aunt Cecile, then her colleague Jin, who had invited her to that charity event and who had once been the person she talked to more than anyone. Gone, all of them, one by one, until the only voice in her daily life was his. He had hit her for the first time on a Tuesday evening in March, 16 months into the marriage. It was not a slap. It was calculated, the kind of blow that leaves no mark visible above a collar. Afterward, she stood in the bathroom with both hands on the sink and looked at herself in the mirror for a long time. Then she went back into the kitchen and finished making dinner because she did not yet have a language for what had just happened. The language comes later, after the shame loosens enough to let words through. He had never touched her face. That was deliberate too. He was not a man who made careless mistakes. 2 more years passed after that first Tuesday. She stayed because she believed it was her careful management of him that prevented further escalation. She stayed because leaving felt more dangerous than remaining. She stayed because she had, by that point, no one to leave to. And then one night she sat on the bathroom floor at 2 in the morning with her back against the cold tile wall and her hand pressed against a stomach that was just beginning to tell her something she had not planned for. And she understood with absolute clarity that she was no longer making this decision for herself alone. 4 days later, she left, in the middle of the night, without a word. 9 hours of driving without stopping. Not once did she look in the rearview mirror. Not because she wasn't afraid, but because she had decided in that car on that night that the only direction that mattered was forward. That had been 9 months ago. And now he was 12 feet behind her in aisle 7 of a grocery store, and she could feel the weight of his attention on the back of her neck. That same dull, specific pressure that arrives before a storm. Maren Kale was not the kind of person who stood out in a grocery store. She was 54 years old, compact in the way of someone who had spent a lifetime moving efficiently through spaces. She had silver-streaked hair cut close on one side and longer on the other, giving her face an asymmetry that people sometimes found striking and sometimes found unsettling, depending on which side they approached her from. She wore a gray canvas jacket with too many pockets, the kind that suggested she was always prepared to carry more than she had come with. She had been in aisle 6 when she heard the voice. Not the word, not the name. Just the register of it, the pitch and control of a man addressing a woman he believed he still owned. She had heard that register before. She would have recognized it in a hurricane. She moved to the end of the aisle quietly, the way she did most things, and looked around the corner. She saw a woman in a pale green coat standing very still near the middle of the aisle with one hand resting on her midsection and her head turned slightly, not quite toward the voice, not quite away from it. The posture of someone calculating, not panicking, calculating. Maren recognized this too. She had seen it in the mirror once, in a different life, in a different city, in a bathroom with a broken lock on the door. She also saw the man, and the woman beside him, younger, vivid, leaning into his arm with the ease of someone who did not yet know what she was leaning into. Maren did not move immediately. She watched for 4 seconds, long enough to read the situation, long enough to be certain. Then she reached into the left pocket of her jacket, the one where she always kept a card, and wrapped her fingers around it without taking it out. And she started walking. Maren Kale had built her current life on a foundation of controlled distance. She ran a crisis relocation consultancy out of a 3-room office on the 4th floor of a building on Caswell Street. The work was not advertised. It did not need to be. It moved through networks the way certain information moves, without announcement, from one person who needed to know to the next. She helped people disappear from situations that had become unsurvivable. She found housing, arranged documentation, and connected them with lawyers who handled the precise legal complexity that arrived when you left a powerful man without warning. She was exceptionally good at it. People who worked with her assumed it was because she was organized, calm under pressure, possessed of an intelligence that could hold 20 variables simultaneously without losing any of them. All of this was true. None of it was the reason. The reason lived further back. In a town called Dunrath, in a house on a street called Verity Close, where a younger version of Maren had spent 6 years married to a man named Aldrich Senna, whose public reputation was so immaculate that when she finally told her sister what was happening, her sister had looked at her with an expression that was not quite disbelief, but something adjacent to it. Something that said, "Are you sure you're remembering it correctly?" She was sure. Certainty had been the one thing Aldrich could not take from her, though not for want of trying. He had been, like Chrysanto Vale, a man of patient and exacting control. Not violent in the ways that leave evidence, violent in the ways that leave nothing visible at all. The kind that happens in a tone of voice, in a look across a dinner table that no one else present could read but her. In the slow erosion of every version of herself that existed before she married him, until what remained was a woman she barely recognized, who second-guessed every word before speaking it, who apologized for things that were not her fault, who had learned to read the temperature of a room the moment she entered it, because the temperature of the room determined everything. She had left on a Wednesday afternoon while Aldrich was at a meeting she had deliberately scheduled on his behalf to give herself 3 uninterrupted hours. She took only what she could carry. She left the car because it was registered in his name, and she understood, even then, how tracking worked. She rebuilt herself over the following 4 years with the methodical patience that becomes available only to someone who has survived something they did not think they would. She returned to school. She connected with an organization doing the work she now did professionally. She built, eventually, something that looked and felt like safety. But the memory of what it felt like to be inside a body that was simultaneously completely still and completely terrified, that she had not lost. She had never forgotten the mathematics of it. The way your face had to hold one expression while every cell beneath your skin was broadcasting something entirely different. The cost of that. Paid not in a single sum but in daily installments over years, compounding in the background of everything else you were trying to be. And the one thing she had needed most in a supermarket aisle in Dunrath on the afternoon she first understood she had to leave. The one thing that had not been there. Another person. Someone who saw it. Someone who did not look away, and did not look too hard either. Who made themselves present in a way that said, "I see what is happening here, and you are not alone in it." She had made herself a promise that afternoon, standing with a box of cereal in her hand and her heart knocking against her ribs. If she ever had the ability to be that person for someone else, she would not calculate the cost. She would not weigh her comfort against their need. She would simply move. She was moving now. Her coffee was still on the shelf in aisle 6, forgotten beside a brand of pasta she had not needed. She did not go back for it. Some things were worth leaving behind. She had learned that earlier and more thoroughly than most people ever had to. And she had already decided, before she reached Sable, exactly what she would say and exactly what she would not. Because the difference between those two things was, in her experience, the difference between helping someone and frightening them back into silence. Marin reached her without making it look like reaching. She simply appeared at Sable's side the way a person appears when they have been walking in that direction anyway, browsing the lower shelves with the unhurried air of someone deciding between 2 brands of something she did not particularly need. She picked up a jar, turned it over. Read the label with the focused attention of a woman with nowhere to be, and nothing more pressing on her mind than the sodium content of canned tomatoes. She was close enough that Sable could have touched her without fully extending her arm. "The ones on the left are better," Marin said quietly, without looking up. "For what it's worth." Sable said nothing. Her eyes were fixed on a point in the middle distance while her peripheral vision did the work her direct gaze could not afford right now. She was tracking him. The position of his feet. The angle of his shoulders. The way he had gone still the moment he said her name. That practiced stillness she had learned to read, years ago, as something that preceded movement. He was still there. 12 feet. Maybe 11 now. "I'm fine," Sable said. The words came automatically, before thought could intervene. the reflex of a woman who had spent years making herself smaller than her own fear, so that the people around her would stop looking. Miran set the jar down and picked up another. She did not react to the words, did not correct them, did not offer the sympathetic tilt of the head that well-meaning strangers sometimes offered, the one that made everything worse by making everything visible. She simply said very quietly, "I know." 2 words. Not "I know you're not fine." Not "I can see what's happening." Just, "I know." Stripped of performance, stripped of invitation, stripped of everything except the bare acknowledgement itself. It did not ask Sable to explain or justify or confirm the lie she had just told. It recognized something, the way one person recognizes it in another when both of them have stood in the same room before, even if they have never met. Sable's grip on the basket tightened. Behind her, she heard him say something to the woman at his side. Low, conversational. She could not make out the words, but she did not need to. She could feel the shift in his attention the way you feel a door open in a room with no windows, a change in pressure, subtle and unmistakable. She had spent years learning to feel that shift before it completed itself. "He's going to walk over," Sable said. Flat, certain. The tone of someone stating whether. "Yes," Miran said. "He is. I don't have anyone to call." Miran looked at her then. Not with pity. Not with the brightness some people brought to others' misfortune. She looked at her the way you look at someone you recognize. Fully. Without flinching. Without the slight retreat that recognition sometimes produces in people who are not sure they want to be involved. "You don't need to call anyone," she said. "I'm already here." Sable held that for 1 second. Then Crisanto Vale's footsteps started moving. He stopped 3 feet away. He was tall, Crisanto. Broad through the chest in the way of a man who understood the space he occupied and had long since learned to use it as a form of language. He was 41 years old and still looked like the man she had met at that charity event, which was the cruelest thing about him. The outside had never adjusted to reflect the inside. He smiled. Sable. He said her name again, this time with the softness he deployed in public. The version of his voice that had convinced so many people over so many years that he was a man of patience and grace. "I didn't know you were in the city." She said nothing. He looked at her coat, at the way it fell across her midsection. Something moved behind his eyes. A calculation assembled and filed in under 2 seconds. "You look well," he said. Miran took 1 step forward. Not aggressive, not theatrical. Just a single, deliberate step that placed her at Sable's left side, with their arms nearly touching. She did not look at Crisanto. She addressed Sable directly. "Did you still want to grab coffee after this?" Her voice was easy, warm. The voice of someone resuming a conversation that had been briefly interrupted. "The place on Alderton closes early on Tuesdays." Sable understood immediately what was being offered. Not a rescue, not a confrontation. A door, plausible, ordinary, undramatic, through which she could walk without handing him anything to react to. Without the escalation he was so practiced at engineering through manufactured provocation. She looked at Miran. Miran's expression said, "You choose. I am here regardless of what you decide." That was the thing. That was the exact thing that moved through Sable's chest like something unlocking after a long time in a dark place. Not the offer of help. The placement of the choice, firmly and unmistakably, back in her own hands. After years of having every choice removed without notice, rerouted, overridden, being handed one back was almost more than she knew how to receive. "Yes," Sable said. "Let's go." She did not look at Crisanto as she turned. She offered no explanation, no apology, no word in his direction. She simply turned, the way a person turns away from something that no longer holds any claim over their attention, and walked toward the end of the aisle with Marin beside her. Behind her, she heard him say her name one more time. Quiet. Controlled. The version that was not a question. The woman at his side said something to him. A bright, uncertain sound. The voice of someone with no map for what had just occurred. Sable felt something brief and complicated for that woman. Not contempt. Not envy. Something closer to sorrow, for what she did not yet know, and for what knowing would eventually cost her. That feeling lasted 4 seconds. Then she was through the end of the aisle and it folded itself away. Her hands did not shake. The coffee shop on Alderton Street was called Wren and Company. It had 8 tables, mismatched chairs, and a chalkboard menu written in handwriting that slanted heavily to the left. The kind of place that had been there long enough to feel permanent without ever becoming fashionable. Where the person behind the counter knew regulars by order rather than name, and where the background music was always something instrumental and just quiet enough to make the person across from you the loudest thing in the room. Moran ordered 2 teas without asking. She set one in front of Sable, sat down across from her, and said nothing for a long moment. She let the silence settle on its own, the way sediment falls in undisturbed water, without rushing it toward something more comfortable. It was Sable who spoke first. "How did you know?" she asked. "The way you were standing," Moran said. "And the way he said your name." "People say names." "Not like that." Sable looked at her tea. The steam curled upward and disappeared. "He runs an organization," she said finally. 3 counties. Maybe more now. I've been careful not to know. People around him don't ask questions. Judges who know him don't ask questions. He has a talent for making the world behave in ways that are convenient for him. She paused. "I knew all of this before I married him. I thought I understood what I was agreeing to. I didn't realize that agreeing to the organization meant agreeing to become part of how it functioned. Another managed asset. Another thing that existed in its designated place and did not deviate." Miran said nothing. Her hands were around her cup. She was listening with the quality of attention that differs from ordinary listening, the kind that does not wait for its own turn to speak. "I left 9 months ago," Sable continued. "I had been planning it for 4 months before that. I did everything I could to make it clean. New city, new paperwork under a different name. Cash only. No digital trail I could avoid." She looked at the table. "I was careful." "You were very careful," Moran said. "You're still here." "He found me anyway." "He found you in a grocery store," Moran said. "That is not the same as finding where you live. It is not the same as having you." Sable looked at her. There was something exact in the way this woman chose words. Not clinical, but precise. The manner of someone who had learned through direct experience to say what was actually true rather than what was merely reassuring. "I'm pregnant," Sable said. Flat. Factual. Without the apology that used to accompany every statement she made about herself. "I know," Miran said. "It's his." A pause. "He doesn't know. I didn't know when I left. I found out about 6 weeks after I arrived here." The quiet that followed had weight to it. Not uncomfortable. Simply real. "When I found out," Sable said, "I thought about going back. Not because I wanted to. Because I told myself a child deserved a father, and I thought that having something to lose might change what he was." The next words came without inflection, because the inflection had long since burned away, leaving only the fact beneath. "I held that thought for 48 hours, and then I remembered the way he had looked at me the night I understood I had to go, and I knew that a child would not soften him. A child would be one more thing he owned." Before she could reach for her tea, something moved through her from below the surface. A low, interior shift. Not pain, just Wren, adjusting her position the way she had been doing more frequently in the last 2 weeks, asserting herself in the quiet moments as if she understood, on some cellular level, that the quiet moments were the ones that needed her presence most. Sable stopped mid-breath. She placed her hand flat on the table, palm down, and breathed steadily through her nose until the shift settled. Marin watched, did not speak, did not ask. After a moment, Sable looked up. "She does that," she said. "When I go very still, as if she's checking." "Maybe she is," Marin said. Sable looked at her own hand on the table, at the steadiness of it. Then she said something she had not said aloud since the night she sat on the bathroom floor and understood the only decision left to make. "I used to be afraid to love her too much," she said, "before I left. Because loving something gives him a surface to press against. He had a way of finding whatever mattered most to you and placing himself between you and it." She paused. "For months, I was afraid that she would become the thing he used to pull me back. And then I understood that she was the only reason I had the courage to go in the first place." The room held that sentence. "She saved you," Marin said. "We saved each other," Sable said quietly. "She just didn't know she was doing it." For a moment, neither of them spoke. The instrumental music moved through the room unhurried. Someone behind the counter dropped something metal and the sound rang and faded and the quiet returned. Sable became aware, in that quiet, of how long it had been since she had sat across from another person and said true things without calculating the cost of each one first. There was a fatigue to honesty that nobody warned you about. Not the honesty itself, but the years of withholding it, the way that shaped the muscles of your throat and jaw so that speaking plainly felt, at first, like working against your own body. She looked at the window. Outside, the street was ordinary. People moving with bags and dogs and the preoccupied expressions of people with somewhere to be. "No one in this city knows I'm here. The people I had before him are gone or so far outside my life now that reaching back would mean explaining 5 years I still don't have full language for." She turned back. "I have remote work. Translation, 4 languages. It keeps things running. I have the apartment on Fenwick. A locked door and a routine and 9 months of being careful." Her voice stayed level. "And then this morning." "And then this morning," Marin said. "He looked at me in that aisle," Sable said, and the look said what it always said. That he was patient. That he was not finished. That whatever I had built was something he intended to reach, in his own time. Her eyes were bright in a way that had nothing to do with composure. "I am so tired of building with one hand while the other holds the door. I want my daughter to be born in a room where I am not afraid. I don't know yet if that is possible, but I want it." Not a plea. A declaration. The most unadorned thing a person could want for a child she was already fiercely guarding before that child had drawn a single breath outside her body. Marin was quiet for a moment. "What's your daughter's name?" she asked. Sable blinked. "I haven't decided." "What are you considering?" It was such an ordinary question, so entirely removed from the territory they had been in for the past 10 minutes. Sable opened her mouth, closed it, and then something moved across her face that had not moved there in a very long time, something that began behind her eyes and traveled to her mouth and arrived as something small and unguarded and entirely real. She almost smiled. "Ren," she said. "I've been thinking about Ren." Moran glanced up at the sign above the counter, then back at Sable. "Fitting," she said. She reached into the left pocket of her jacket and placed a card on the table between them. Plain. A name, a phone number, and 4 words underneath. "You don't start over alone." "I want to make 2 phone calls," Moran said. "One to a housing advocate. One to a family attorney named Petra Soland who has handled cases like yours for 13 years and has never lost a protective order filing. I would like to make both calls tonight if you'll allow it. What you do with what comes from them is entirely your decision." Sable looked at the card. She looked at the 4 words beneath the number. She looked at them long enough that they stopped being words and became something else. A ledge. Something to hold on to while the ground was still uncertain beneath her feet. She picked it up. Meran made the calls from the sidewalk outside, while Sable sat at the table with both hands around her tea and watched through the window. She could not hear the conversations. She could only see the way Meran spoke. Without urgency, without performance. The way someone speaks when the infrastructure behind their words has been in place for years, and the words themselves are the last step. She was on the phone for 11 minutes. When she came back inside, she sat down and delivered what had been arranged, most immediate first. A safe apartment on the north side of the city. Furnished. Second floor. 2 deadbolts and a building entrance requiring a key card. Available tonight. The name on the lease would not be Sable's. Petra Soland would call the following morning at 8 for full intake. She worked cases involving organized crime adjacency. The legal complexity that arose when the person you were leaving had reached that made standard protective orders feel like suggestions. Petra did not treat them as suggestions. A physician at a clinic on the east side worked with women in transitional situations and would see Sable for a complete prenatal appointment within the week. Under a name of Sable's choosing, no insurance paperwork required. He will file something, Sable said, when he realizes I'm not going to surface on my own. He'll use whatever legal mechanism is most available. He has done it before. I know, Marin said. Petra knows too. Whatever he files will not reach you before she reaches it first. That is the sequence we need to hold. She folded her hands on the table. Tonight, I need you to do one thing. Write down everything you remember. Not a formal statement. Just everything. Dates where you have them, details where you don't. What happened in the order it happened, in whatever words come. The writing is not for the court yet. It is for you. So that you stop carrying it in your body as the only place it exists. Sable was quiet for a moment. What if writing it makes it more real? It is already real, Marin said. Not unkindly, simply accurately. Writing it gives it somewhere to live outside of you. That night, Sable sat at the small desk in the furnished apartment, a room that smelled of clean wood and unfamiliar soap, and wrote for 3 hours. She wrote about the first time, the third time, the night she drove 9 hours without once checking the rear view. She wrote about a phone screen with no contacts left on it, about the bathroom floor and the cold tile, and the moment she understood she was no longer deciding for herself alone. She wrote until her hand ached, and the page held more than she had ever given another human being in her life. Then she set the pen down and placed both palms flat on the desk and sat in the silence of the room and listened to her own breathing. And in that silence, something she had been carrying for a very long time quietly set itself down. Petra Soland called at 8 o'clock exactly. Her voice was unhurried and stripped of performative warmth, not cold, but precise in the way of someone who had learned that real kindness lived in the work, not the preamble. She asked Sable to begin from the beginning and listened without interrupting for 34 minutes. Sable knew the duration because she had developed, without intending to, the habit of tracking time during difficult conversations, a mechanism of control she had never fully unlearned. If she knew how long something was taking, she knew when it would end. When Petra finally spoke, her first words were not about the law. You did the right thing leaving, she said. 9 months ago and again, yesterday in that aisle. I will tell you this at several points during this process, because there will be moments that make it feel otherwise. In those moments, it helps to have heard it enough times that you can reach it without having to search. Then she talked about the law. The emergency protective order was filed by end of day. The grounds were substantial. Sable's written account from the previous night, combined with records Petra had already requested. A hospital visit 2 years into the marriage for a rib injury documented as a fall. A police welfare check filed by a neighbor and subsequently dropped at Sable's own insistence, and employment records showing a pattern of abrupt income restriction that corresponded precisely with escalation periods. Together, they built a picture that required, in Petra's words, no interpretation at all. Crisanto Vielle was served 4 days later. Sable was not present when it happened. She was at the clinic on the east side, lying on a paper-covered table in a room with a window that looked onto a courtyard holding 3 bare November trees, listening to her daughter's heartbeat on an external monitor for the first time. It was a rapid, steady percussion, slightly faster than she had expected, as though the child already knew something about urgency and had decided to arrive at the world running. The technician, a quiet woman named Bex, who wore her reading glasses on a chain around her neck, turned the monitor so Sable could see the screen. "She's positioned well," Bex said. "Strong." Sable looked at the screen without speaking, at the shape of a person she had been protecting for 7 months through nothing but forward motion. Through 9 hours of driving and 6 weeks of Tuesday mornings and 100 locked doors and 9 months of standing on a sidewalk with her hand on her stomach and promising only what she could actually promise. "We're okay. We're still okay." They were still okay. She stayed in that room for a while after Beck stepped out. She lay with her hand on her own stomach and listened to the residual hum of the monitor and thought about a name written on a card in a coffee shop, and about the way Mehran had not flinched when she said it, and about how the smallest dignities, being believed, being given a choice, being handed a cup of tea by someone who did not need anything from you, could carry the weight of enormous things. Crisanto's legal response came 12 days after service. It was, as Petra had anticipated, an attempt to manufacture jurisdictional confusion around the pregnancy. A claim that Sable had vacated their shared domicile in a manner constituting parental interference with respect to an unborn child. A filing designed not to prevail, but to complicate, to drain time, money, and resolve he had calculated she no longer possessed. He had miscalculated. Petra's response was filed within 48 hours. 41 pages, 11 precedents, the hospital record, the welfare check. The neighbor's original statement never entered into any prior proceeding, and Sable's written account from the night in the furnished apartment, which Petra told the court was the most coherent and thorough primary documentation she had encountered in 13 years of practice. The jurisdictional claim was dismissed. The protective order was upheld and expanded. Mehran called that afternoon. She did not say congratulations. She said, "How are you feeling?" Sable was sitting on the edge of the bed in the north side apartment, afternoon light falling across the floor in a long, pale rectangle, and she said something she had not said truthfully in a very long time. "I think I'm okay," she said. "Actually okay. Not the other kind." A brief silence. "Good," Moran said. One word. And in it was everything that did not need adding. 2 weeks after the ruling, Sable found a ground-floor apartment 4 blocks from the clinic. A proper bedroom, a kitchen with a window above the sink looking onto a shared garden, and a second room, small enough to feel like a secret, which was precisely the right size for someone not yet born, who did not yet need more than warmth and proximity and the sound of a voice she already recognized. She painted it herself on a Saturday afternoon. Pale yellow, the shade that holds light rather than deflecting it. 2 coats. Her back ached by the time she finished. She sat on the floor and looked at the walls and felt something she had not felt since before the marriage, before the Thursday evening at that charity event that had rerouted the entire subsequent course of her life. She sat there for a long time, long enough for the afternoon light to shift across the floor and the room to fill with the particular stillness of a place that has been prepared but not yet inhabited. It was the stillness of a beginning rather than an ending, and she had not felt a beginning in so long that she had to rest inside it for a while before she trusted that it was real. She felt like herself. Not a rebuilt version, not a recovered approximation, just herself, sitting on a floor that was hers, in a room she had made ready, waiting without fear for the person she had made it for. 3 months later, on a Thursday morning in February, Sable Voss walked through the doors of Harwick's grocery store for the first time since the Tuesday she had stood frozen in aisle 7, with her blood turned to standing water, and a name in a mouth she had spent 9 months trying to forget. She had almost chosen a different store. There were 3 within reasonable distance of the new apartment. She had stood at the kitchen window on Wednesday evening with a cup of tea going cold in her hand and considered it, and then decided that choosing a different store would be a concession she was no longer willing to make. She had paid enough in concessions. She was finished rerouting herself around the footprint of someone else's power. She walked in through the front entrance. The sign above the door was still missing its apostrophe. The floors were still the color of old cream. The light above the checkout lanes was still slightly too yellow. Everything was the same. She was not. She moved through the store with the ease of someone who had somewhere to be and was not afraid of arriving there. She did not scan the room at the entrance. She did not count the exits. She put things in her basket with the uncomplicated efficiency of a person choosing what she actually needed. Paid at the register with a card instead of cash, said thank you to the young man who bagged her groceries, and meant it plainly, without the hidden layer that had once lived beneath every exchange she had with the public world. Outside, she stood on the sidewalk in the February cold with her bag in one hand and her phone in the other. The screen held 17 messages from the past 2 days. Her college friend Dara, whom she had called 3 months ago from the furnished apartment on a night when the silence finally became louder than her resistance to breaking it, who had answered on the second ring and, after a long pause, said, "I always knew something was wrong. I'm so sorry I let him push me out." Her Aunt Cecile, a woman from the prenatal group at the clinic named Sandra, who had appeared twice at her door with soup when third trimester back pain made cooking feel impossible. And Maran, whose message read only, "Thinking of you today." No need to reply. She read all 17. Then she pressed one hand against her stomach, where Wren had been quiet all morning in the way she was quiet when sleeping. That deep interior stillness that felt nothing like fear and everything like trust. "We're okay," Sable said. The words she had said every day for 9 months, but the weight of them had changed. Not the words. What it cost her to say them? What they meant now, standing on a sidewalk in February with a phone full of people who knew where she was and wanted to know she was all right. It used to be a contract she made alone because there was no one else to make it with. Today, it was true. She put the phone in her pocket and started walking. She did not know that Marin Kale was sitting in a car at the far end of the parking lot. Engine off, coffee on the dash, a folder of new case files open on the passenger seat. She came to Harwick's on Thursday mornings because a small office supply store 2 doors down carried a brand of folders she had never been able to source anywhere else near Caswell Street. She had not planned to be here at this particular hour. She had not been waiting. But when she looked up from the folder and saw the pale green coat moving through the parking lot, she set the papers down. She watched Sable walk. The pace of it. Head up. Not scanning the street. Not calculating exits. Not holding herself like someone braced for what might arrive without warning. The way she looked, from a distance, like a person who had somewhere she wanted to go and trusted, without needing to verify that she would get there. Marin sat with that for a moment. 11 years. 47 women. Safe housing, legal filings, prenatal appointments under borrowed names, and 3-hour phone calls on the nights that required them. All of it rooted in a box of cereal and a broken lock, and a promise made in a supermarket aisle in Dunrath on a Wednesday afternoon that had felt like the end of something and turned out to be the beginning of everything that followed. She had never once asked whether it was worth it. She asked it now, sitting in a parking lot in February, watching a woman in a pale green coat walk away from a grocery store with her head up and her hands steady and a phone full of names. The answer came without announcement, without ceremony. It always had been. Moran picked up her coffee. It had gone cold. She drank it anyway. Then she opened the folder, found the first page of the first new file, and read the name written at the top. She reached for her phone. There was still work to do. There was always still work to do. And somewhere in a new apartment 4 blocks from a clinic, in a small room painted the color of held light, a name waited patiently on the wall in pale yellow letters, unhurried, certain, for the person it had been made for to arrive.